guys, it's the Loud Americans, and today we're back at it with another video about our favorite book of all time, The Quiet American, of course. So today I'm gonna go over part 1 of this book. Part 1 is basically, it covers chapters 1 through 5, and there are 3 main characters in this book that we have to get familiar with. So number 1, we have Thomas Fowler, who's a British journalist and also the narrator of this story. There is the American Aiden Pyle, who is getting involved in Vietnam because this book takes time or set in the Vietnam War, during the Vietnam War. And then our third character is the silly girl called Phuong. She's a Vietnamese girl. And both Thomas Fowler and Aiden Pyle are in love with her, which is kind of scandalous. But anyways, chapter 1 opens up with Thomas Fowler, and he's waiting for Pyle in his apartment in Vietnam. But then Pyle is running a bit too late, so instead he decides to go meet up with his lover Phuong, who also happens to be Pyle's lover. How crazy is that? So Phuong invites him inside her house, and instead of going to like check up on Pyle to make sure he's okay, she's like, "Do you want a pipe? Do you want a pipe? Do you want a pipe?" And she makes him pipe after pipe after pipe of opium until they eventually fall asleep. And then the next day, Fowler goes off to visit Pyle's apartment. But then, in a shocking turn of events, we find out that Pyle actually isn't home because he's dead. Chapter 2. Fowler's narration switches briefly back to like the beginning, like a while before like he actually died, when Fowler and Pyle like met for the first time. So he describes Pyle as a quiet American, hence the name of our book. And he also mentions that Pyle is really obsessed with this author called York Harding. Now, York Harding wrote a lot about like communism and specifically the Vietnam War, and Pyle was very like knowledgeable, up to date with York Harding's work. Now, this will play a role later when Fowler describes Pyle as a kind of naive and almost like dorky and a nerd, and he only like knows what's going on by the books. But for now, the narrative switches back to when Pyle is dead, and Fowler is standing outside Pyle's apartment, and there's this guy called Vigot, some French guy. And then him and Fowler are discussing like, what caused Pyle's death? And then Vigot implies that Fowler could have killed Pyle, but somehow Fowler is just like, whatever, and he's strangely dismissive about it. Then, as Fowler is leaving the apartment, he gets questioned by another guy, an American this time, but when he brings up his suspicions about Fowler and possibly like the love triangle and what problems that could have caused, Fowler gets really angry. Moving on. Chapter 3. The scene shifts back to Pyle and Fowler's like first interaction, and they're at a hotel and they're like dining, and it's fancy and it's loud and it's like a party and there's music. They meet Phuong over there, and this is when the trouble starts because Pyle and Phuong dance together. And as they're doing their thing, as they're dancing, Fowler's watching them, and he's like, "Oh my god, I am so in love with Phuong." But Miss Hai, who's Phuong's sister, is really into Pyle, and she's like, she wants her sister to get closer to Pyle. So now we see that there's a little trouble starting to brew. But anyways, let's wrap this up and let's get to chapter 4 and chapter 5. So chapter 4 starts with the narrative like a few weeks after the dance at the hotel, and Fowler's in Phat Diem, and that town is like kind of ravaged with fighting, and there's like, it's in shambles, and Fowler's like walking through like a bunch of dead bodies, and he describes them like really nonchalantly. He's like, dead bodies. Anyways, Fowler's like dreaming, and Pyle appears to him in his dream, but then he wakes up and Pyle is legitimately there, and then he's like, "Why are you here in the middle of the night?" And then that's when Pyle decides to drop the bomb that he's in love with Fowler's girl. And Fowler just straight up goes like, "Oh, I only want Phuong for her body," which wasn't very nice of him. Especially considering how like just a few weeks ago, he was like, I'm really in love with her. But similarly, in chapter 5, a few weeks after that, Fowler is in Hanoi, and even though Pyle left, he left Fowler with a letter about his like intentions regarding Phuong. And Fowler the whole time is just like, I never really had her best interests at heart. I just wanted her for her body, which honestly is kind of interesting and sets up a nice theme for the later chapters and the later parts, because how was Fowler just so willing to let Phuong go without doing anything? But stay tuned, because next week Tara is going to be going over part 2 of The Quiet American, where we might get some of our questions answered.